Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to show some of the basic elements of how I created this effect. So we've got an interesting background there. I try and get around to showing you how to do that. And then you can see we've got some gold metal appearing here, and it appears to grow and slowly forms into a crown. I was inspired by the introduction to the crown series. It's not quite the same, but it's quite interesting. And I'll also show you how to create some of the basic gem effects that you'll see in a moment. And there you go. And you can see I've come round to a different view of it here. Now this is done in Eevee, so there are some limitations to Eevee. The gems do look a little flat in some ways. You can get a fair approximation, but you don't get exactly what you would get in Cycles. Nevertheless, I've gone some way to getting a reasonably gem-like effect. You can even see there are little colours appearing on these faceted gems here. And there's a bit of a trade-off to be had between the settings on the gems to give you either a bright colour or a more glass-like look. The problem is with a very glass-like look, as you'll see in the gems at the end here, it looks more like a bead of glass than it does like a faceted gem. So there is a trade-off to be made, as always. So to begin with, what's the core of how to create that effect? Well, we need to create our crown first. I'm just going to create a very basic crown. I'm going to add a mesh circle. We'll go into edit mode, press E and then GZ, and we'll just bring that up a bit. I'm not going to do a lot of detail with this. I did use some reference images, so the crown I created was somewhat similar to the crown jewels of England. So once we've created that, what I'm then going to do is deselect everything, make sure I'm in wireframe mode, and then I'm going to select all of those vertices and all of those vertices. So I've got 1/4 of the circle left, and you can see that's how it's selected. So I'll press X and delete the vertices. I'm now going to come over to here and add the mirror modifier. You can see that's created the other half there, and if I click here to select Y, it will create another piece there as well. If we put clipping on, it will generally merge areas that get too close together. So what I'm also going to do is add, with Control R, I've got loop tools on, an extra loop there, and that's because these are going to be the areas for the uprights. So E, G, Z, and you can see that's pulling those up nicely. And I created them fairly long, and then Control R and maybe 4 subdivisions. The more you create, the smoother it can be. So I just did Control R and then typed 4. But you don't need to put too many in because we're going to smooth this out with the subdivision surface anyway. So we'll select the ends here and we'll change the transform pivot point to 3D cursor. And the 3D cursor is down here, but it is in the center. So you need to make sure it's in the center. I'm going to press O and turn on proportional editing, and we'd leave it at the default to start with, and just press S, Shift Z. So it doesn't scale on the Z. You can see we're starting to bring that in. And we can press G, Z just to bring it down, and then perhaps select these 2 loops and just scale Shift Z again and just scale them out slightly, and you can see that's starting to give us the shape. If I change this to individual origins now, just select these points at the end here, we can now just scale those out, scale Shift Z again, just to have them widen a little bit so they don't narrow too much as they come in. I'll turn proportional editing off and just scale them out a little bit more. There's other ways to do this, of course. And now I'll go back to median point, which is the default, and bring them together. So that will do to start with. I'm going to press Ctrl 2 and put a subdivision surface on there. We might want to bring this point in a little bit more. We go back to 3D cursor, scale Shift Z, just to put a bit more shape on it. And then we'll add a UV sphere, scale it down a bit, and GZ, bring it up here. And shade smooth on both of these. So I'll just put a little bit more detail into the crown, but I'm obviously not going to spend a lot of time modeling this at the moment. So for modeling side pieces on this element, what I did was actually turn the whole thing, rotate Z 45, and what that should do, if you've done it this way, we can select these 2 vertices and then press E and then G Y 0.5, and then the same on the other side, E return G Y minus 0.5. because they're lined up with primary axes. And I'll just shrink those down a little bit, that's a bit too much. Add an extra loop in there, GZ, and scale Z just to narrow those points in. And if you want to, you can obviously bend those in slightly like that. Again, there's other ways to create these shapes. So now I'm going to add another modifier, which is solidify modifier. Just going to collapse each of those modifiers so that I can see what I'm doing. Just drag to that modifier above the subdivision surface and you can see it's much smoother now. And we can play around with the thickness of this modifier to get something we like. Perhaps slightly thicker than that, and that will do for this demonstration. We do want a fair number of vertices in our object for what's coming next. So we'll first apply the mirror modifier, then we'll apply the solidify modifier, and then we'll apply the subdivision surface modifier. If we have a look now, you can see we've got quite a few vertices. And at this point, we can join those two together. There's actually a little cross on top of this one in the real thing, of course. So we'll just do Ctrl J and that joins the two together. So let's just give that a quick material. We'll just call that gold. Give it a yellowy orange base color, metallic all the way up. And we'll make it fairly smooth so that it's fairly reflective. So at this point we're getting into illuminated metals and we obviously need some light in the scene. Now the problem with very shiny surfaces, especially metallic ones, is that it can be a little tricky to illuminate them. The easiest way to do that is with an HDRI background. So let's just add one of those and then I'll show you a little trick. So I've opened up a new window there and we'll go to the shader editor and select world. So there's no material there at all at the moment, so we'll say use nodes and one appears here. It's just a grey background right now, as you can see. Looking through the camera, that's what it looks like. Now initially I wanted a black background, but I wanted to evenly illuminate the metal, and that's why we need a little trick in here. So to begin with, I'm going to add a texture which is an environment texture, and then I just selected one that was a sort of room and then connect that into the background. And there it is. But I don't necessarily want that room in the background, so I need to add a little bit more. But you can see it's now illuminating the metal much better without having added any lights into the scene at all. I did end up adding lights as well, but that's because I wanted to add highlights and things like that were under my control. So I'm now going to add a color mix node, drop that in there and set the other side to black. And if I go all the way to the right, you can see, if I turn that off, the scene is black, there's no light in the scene, and as I come back this way we start to get our background back and it illuminates the scene. So what I want is to only show black when we are looking directly at the background. Everything else I want, in other words reflections, I want to work as normal. So I'm now going to add an input which is a light path node, and it's got all these options coming out of it. The one we're interested in is camera ray. A camera ray is a ray that is going directly from the camera to the background, and it's worded that way because the way that this kind of rendering works is it effectively treats the camera almost as a light and projects rays out from the camera and sees if they hit anything that would have been visible to the camera, rather than trying to work out all light rays in the entire scene, because that would be a much bigger task. So if we've got a ray that could go straight from the camera lens out and hit the background, then this becomes a 1 here. In other words, it pushes that over to black, and there you go, you can see it. And yet if we look in the reflections on the ball here, you can see that our HDRI is still showing. So we get the benefit of the illumination, the relatively realistic illumination of the HDRI, without actually having the background in the scene. You may not want that, but that's an easy little trick. So we've got our HDRI here, going into the top side of a mix shader. We've got a light path node, and you'll notice there are other things in here if you ever wanted to just single out reflections, for example. There they are. But we've got a light path here, we've got is camera ray, and that's controlling the mix on that mix node, and then that just feeds into the background. So we'll close that for now. So that's our basic crown created. So how do we make this appear in a strange way? So I'm going to add a simple cube at the moment. I'm going to put it below the crown. Go into edit mode with all the vertices selected, right click and say subdivide. And I'm going to increase the subdivision somewhat. Probably going to go up to about 25. We may need to add a subdivision surface on this later, which will add many more subdivisions. I'm just going to go to face select, and I'm just going to select some random faces on the top here. Need to select a reasonable number, and then GZ. So I'm not extruding, I'm just pulling these faces up a little bit. And now I'm going to turn on proportional editing, GZ again, and narrowed it in, and we'll go a bit more. Now you can start to see why I need quite a few faces on this object. GZ again, and I can just hide the crown for a moment. I think what I'm going to do now is actually I am going to subdivide once more, and I'm just selecting random faces around the place. I'm just having a few fairly tall objects, and then I'm going to do Ctrl 2 and add a subdivision surface. So we've got a cube now with these spikes. So I do Alt H and we can bring everything else back. Now what's important is that this cube can entirely enclose the crown. So I'm going to make it a little bigger already. Go to wireframe and we'll move that cube upward. If I select the crown, you can just see, looking from all areas, that crown is completely enclosed. And what that means for our purposes is that it's visible, or it will be. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go to, say, frame 100 and store the location of what was a cube. Go back to the beginning, GZ, and we're going to pull the cube to just below the crown. Now obviously you can spend a bit more time and put some more shapes on this cubic object. What I suggest is that they take this sort of form. You don't necessarily want pieces sort of sticking out to one side, because then when you see what we do next, parts of the crown will appear and then disappear. Whereas the idea of this is that it grows. So we've moved this down. I'm going to press I and location. So I'm now just going to press play, and we'll see that move up to there. And you might want to do it over more frames than that. So I think what I'll do is I'll just pull up the dope sheet. I've already got those keyframes selected. So just press S to scale, and then I can take that out to perhaps 250. Well, maybe we'll take it to 200 frames. So now when I press play, you can see this slowly comes out. And what's important is that parts of the cube, or parts of the cube that are sticking up, intersect with the crown. And that's why I'm saying you need to take a bit more time and make sure that there are parts like that. So if I come through here, and what I can do is scale Shift Z and thicken this one up. I'm just making the whole cube a little bigger there, and you can see that's going to, at least some of these are going to impinge. As I say, we really need to make sure that there's enough of these spikes to impinge in lots of areas on the cube. And I can always add more, of course. So if I take that one and bring that one up there, perhaps take this one, and that's fine. Eventually the whole thing will be enclosed and the whole crown will be there. So how do we make it appear? We'll select our crown and we'll add a new modifier, which is a Boolean modifier. Now, word of warning, as it's been for quite some time, Booleans can be a little buggy and it's always a bit of a battle. So make sure you've saved your file before you do anything with this Boolean modifier. I'm going to name this object down here now, and we'll call this bool, and we'll call the other item crown. So we can now select our crown and then select bool as the object that we want to operate. And you can already see it's pausing. So what you can do is set it to fast to begin with. Probably should have done before I selected the object. And I ended up using fast because I found with the number of vertices I had, exact was just taking too long for each frame. And then we need to set this to intersect. And you notice the crown has disappeared. So let's start moving through. You can see the animation is going very slowly now. So I have to just skip through like this. And what's happened is that we are saying only have crown where there is this bool object. If I go to wireframe, the selected area is the crown. So you can see we've got a bit of crown appearing there. And what I'm actually going to do now, I think, is select that and then come up to properties here. Under visibility, I'm going to turn it off in renders, and under viewport display, I'll turn off shadows as well, by the way. We don't need shadows there, and I'm going to say just show the bounding box. So I can now go back to solid view, and you can see the crown starting to appear as it intersects with those spikes that we put on it. As I said, the more spikes you put on there, the more likely you'll get some coinciding with the crown, and you'll get some interesting growth of the crown as they travel through. And that's why the shape, because it looks much more like it's growing then. And you can see there it is, and by the time we get to the end, the box completely encloses it and the crown has reappeared. So that's how you make the crown grow. So we'll talk about the background next. So to do the background, we'll just switch to rendered view first of all, and I'm just going to disable the visibility of our Boolean object from the viewport so we can see what's going on. I'm going to turn off the grid floor at this point as well. So then I'm going to call up a new window, and we'll change that to the shader editor, and from object we'll change that to world. So you can see we've got this in here at the moment to illuminate our crown. So rather than just as it is, we'll add some new inputs into the volume input on the world. So first of all, we'll add under shaders a volume scatter node, and we'll put that in there, and you can see everything's disappeared at the moment. Make sure that's full white as well. Then we'll add under converter a math node, connect that into the density here and change that to multiply, and I used a value of about 0.005. Then we'll add a color ramp. I set it to ease, it's up to you what you use. Put that into the other side of the multiply node, and then just bring the general nodes in somewhere around here. And then finally we'll add a texture, which is a noise texture. Connect that into the color ramp. At this point, make sure, if I haven't said already, that you're in EV mode, because this is going to use a lot of memory if you're in cycles mode and may cause problems, because we're adding a very large volumetric effect. Once you're sure you're in EV, we can go to rendered view. I set my noise to 4D. That just gives you literally an extra dimension that you can play with. I set my W value, which is what 4D gives you, to 4.5. I set my scale to 0.25. I put detail up to the maximum, although you can go higher if you type the number in. I put roughness at about 0.6, and I set distortion to 3, which gives you sort of swirls. I also put anisotropy at -0.5, and I did get in the preview this sort of banding appearing, but it didn't show up in the render, so that's fine. And then we just need to adjust the settings here to get the effect that we're looking for, but because we're in EV, we do need to tweak some of the EV settings for this to show properly. So I'm going to turn on screen space reflections, not that that will make much of a difference at this point, but it will make a difference to seeing reflections of reflections in the metallic objects. I did use bloom as well, but I won't worry about that at the moment. But under volumetrics, I set this to 2 pixels, which is a much higher resolution than you would see for the default. I turned on volumetric lighting and shadows. I set shadows to 32 samples, and I put distribution up at 0.9. We don't have many lights in the scene yet, other than the ambient light to really illuminate everything. With the crown selected, let's just add the default 3-point lights. We may well need to turn the brightness of these lights up, but we'll give them a go. So let's try 500 watts for that light, maybe even 5,000 watts. There you can begin to see something. Then the fill lamp, we'll try 250 watts, and the key lamp, we'll try 1000 watts. Now you can start to see we're getting some effects from the volumetrics, and you can play around with the color ramp here, have more or less black around each of the volumetric areas, and if you play around with the W value, you can see it starts to move around. I think I'm going to put the scale up slightly. We'll go for 0.5, and there you go. If you color the lamp slightly, so if with the key lamp, for example, I give that a slightly yellowish hue, you can see we get a yellow cast to that background, or parts of it. The other thing is you can animate that background by, if I go to the beginning of the animation frames and I hover my mouse over the noise texture, I made sure I've got that box selected as well, and then press I and record that position, and then I go to the end of the animation and I add 1 or 2 values to it. So let's say make that 8 and press I again. The other thing you want to do is not use the default Bezier, because otherwise it will be effectively static to begin with, it will then speed up and it will slow down again. So we want to just right click that little keyframe point there, go to interpolation mode and select linear, and now it'll be the same speed throughout. And we probably won't have enough processing power to be able to show you the background animating in real time. Now you can see we've only got 1 frame a second or so, but if I just step through the frames as it updates, you can see, we should be able to see the background very slowly animating. If I go through higher number of frames, it sort of swirls, and some of that swirl is down to this distortion that we added rather than it just being different chunks of noise appearing. So that's our animated background. So let's talk about the gems. I'm not going to cover this in gems, but I will show you the basics of how I created the gems. So we'll change this back to object. We'll go to the end of the animation where we can see the whole crown, and we'll put our cursor there. So now just add under mesh diamonds, and then you can select some different shape objects here. So if we selected brilliant diamond, for example, we get a gem shaped like this. If I turn cavity on, that may make the geometry a little easier to see. So you can leave the back on if you want. I decided to remove that. Obviously the whole shape really is what is the brilliant cut, which gives you, certainly with a cycles render, a better set of refractions and reflections. However, we don't really have much of that in Eevee, so I decided to largely remove that. So I selected that end point and then all the points up to there, perhaps even just box select it like that, with proportional editing off, scale Z0, and then perhaps just EGZ just to give it a bit of a rim. Now you will need to select all of the vertices and then go under mesh, under cleanup, merge by distance, and you can see it's merged 64 vertices because they were right on top of each other. So we've now got a simple gem that will do for our purposes. We just need to give it a material name. So we'll go to materials and we'll say new, and we'll call this one diamond. As I say, there are limitations. There's limitations even in cycles, but there's even more limitations on what you can achieve in Eevee. So it's about compromises and just going for an effect. So we'll go to rendered view. It's quite a large gem at the moment, so we'll scale it down a little, and we'll just put it somewhere close to the crown so that it's picking up some of the light. So it's just a shiny white object right now. So first of all, we'll just set that to full white. It doesn't really matter because we're going to put a different input for the base color in a moment. Metallic off. Roughness I set to about 0.03. So very low roughness value, is very reflective. Index of refraction I had set to 2.418, which I think from memory is roughly that of diamond. I set transmission to 0.94 so that it's not completely opaque, but nor is it very transparent. So you can see it's getting a little more to it now. I'm just going to go back to the Eevee settings and go and open up screen space reflections and turn on refraction. I'm going to turn off half res trace, which is a method for optimizing ray tracing to make Eevee run a little faster, but obviously I want it as accurate as possible. I don't think it makes a huge difference, to be honest, for this scene. I also put the trace precision up to 0.875. I decreased the thickness to 0.05, which I think just means it will take account of smaller objects when it's working out reflections and refractions. So back to the material properties. We can make it more transparent than that, but at the moment it won't be transparent at all because we need to change some settings down here. By default, things are always opaque in Eevee, again, obviously an optimization thing. So we'll change this to alpha blend for the blend mode. You can see that's essentially made it almost transparent, you almost can't see it now. And shadow mode, I set that to alpha hashed. If I increase that all the way to the top, we can see our shape again, and it's a matter of compromise. Obviously if I turn it all the way down, it's almost not there. So you just have to work out what's going to work for you. I'm going to go back to 0.9 for now. Then coming back up here, I'm going to add 2 more nodes. I'm going to add inverter, which is a color ramp, and I'm going to add an input, which is layer weight. So this node effectively measures what angle light has bounced off an object before it effectively reaches the camera. Of course, it all happens in reverse in reality. I'm going to set the blend value to 0.9, then connect the facing output into the color ramp. Add another node, and I'm going to make that white as well. I'm going to take that node and just stick it in the middle somewhere, and then I'm going to take the color output and put that into here. I'm going to make that middle one white as well. So that's 3 white nodes. It doesn't really do anything at the moment. Now we can do something different. So I'm going to start to add some colors. Add another node and we'll make this one perhaps red, and add another node and perhaps make this one green, and I'll stick that one over here just because that's what I did before, and perhaps have a cyan sort of color, a violetish sort of color, and then finally a reddish color. So I've made these colors a little stronger than I did before, just so that they're more visible. I made them quite pastel sort of colors. And you can now see, if I move this gem around, little sort of colored reflections. I'm going to turn the transmission off for a minute, and maybe we'll go slightly higher on the roughness, 0.04. It just makes the reflections a little easier to see. We also want to turn on screen space refraction in these settings. So this object is very large at the moment, so we'll scale it to 0.1 of its current size. And it's obviously also affected by the color of the light that's reflecting off it. So as I said, I used much more pastel colors than this, and that worked a bit better, but it gives you a general idea of how you can get gems to work, and you just need to play around with these settings because it's all affected by the light in the scene as well. The other thing I did was change this to cardinal, because that then gives you a more sudden change between one color and the next, and you can see as I'm moving around we're getting this sudden change between the colors. We can also turn on bloom, of course, which will give us a few extra little elements, and if we turn on backface culling for the material, you can see we get a slightly more glittery sort of gem, but we lose some of the transparency. I'm just going to turn that bloom down a little bit. It's just a little bit less intense, and as I said, I used more pastel colors originally for my gem, but you can get the general idea of how that works. So just quickly, how can you get that gem to sit on a nice little band that runs around the crown? Just did Alt R there just to remove the rotation. I'm going to rotate it on the Y by 90, and I'm going to select my crown, go to edit mode, and we'll select, I think, that with holding Alt down, that loop of vertices, Shift D, and then we'll G, Z, move that in the Z axis just down to here, and then P, separate by selection. And you can see there it is, a group of vertices, and it's currently called Crown 001. We'll rename this to Crown Ring. Come out of edit mode. It's disappeared because we still have the Boolean operator working on it, so we'll remove that, and there we can see it now. We'll say set origin to geometry. We can press F3 and say convert to curve. Seems to have done that now. So we've now got a curve object, which is a ring that's exactly the right size for the crown. If we need to, we can just size it up a little bit just to bring it slightly above the surface, but I'll put it there. And now we'll go to our gem, bring that down to here, somewhere fairly close. Make sure you've applied rotation and scale on the ring, and again apply rotation and scale to the gem. Then going to add an array modifier to the gem, and just put a few more of those in, and then we'll add curve modifier, and we'll follow the crown ring curve. I've set the duplication axis to be the Z axis. I'm just scaling it up, in this case on the Y, just to get the shape back again, and just pushing it in just to be fairly close. Things work slightly less intuitively than normal when you're working like this. Once you've got it about right, we can change this to fit curve and select the curve, and there you go. It automatically put the right number of objects around to completely surround the shape. Obviously they're slightly off, and we can play around with the relative offset to get what we need. Obviously we want a little gap between them, but we don't want them impinging on each other. And you can then either join the shapes or not as you see fit. If I just turn that bloom down a little bit more, and you can see the sort of effect we're getting. It's reasonably convincing. We're getting a nice sort of glittery look to our diamonds there. It's as if we're getting a little diffraction of light around the gem, when in actual fact all it is it's just giving us a slightly different colour depending on the angle of the light that we're getting off it, but it's still quite a good gem-like effect. So I hope you found this tutorial interesting. If you did, let me know. Please remember to click the like and particularly the subscribe button, as this helps me out a lot, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.